This is Dateline News and Conversation. Whoa, the topic tonight, Verboten. We're going to talk about anti Semitism tonight, and we're going to try to debunk the accusation of anti Semitism. We're going to talk about how this is a reflection of the Jewish population in the United States and media control. We're also going to talk about and begin to talk about the trauma that has been inflicted upon the people of Palestine. My guest tonight, an esteemed and very well-known attorney, returning to the show after a little bit of a pause, Sylvia Demarest. Sylvia, welcome to the show.
Hey, Regis, good to see you again.
Boy, I'll tell you, it is good to see you, and you've been really prolific in analyzing a number of situations that have been ongoing throughout the world. And your analysis is absolutely brilliant, especially your analysis of this Israeli genocide upon the Palestinian people. So tonight, the first topic, let's get it out of the way. Anti-Semitism. What is it? Where does it come from, Sylvia?
Well, in terms of this topic, what we're really talking about in terms of what's going on in Israel is Zionism. And Zionism is a very small part of the entire Jewish milieu. And Zionism is not supported by most Jews, actually. And in fact, most Zionists are not Jews, and most Jews are not Zionists. So what has happened is, in order to excuse and to avoid any observation and discussion of what has been going on in Palestine since really the dawn of the 20th century, has been the fact that there's been a narrative constructed about what's going on, and any information outside that narrative has been called anti-Semitism, whether or not that information is based on the facts, is verifiably true, and does not reflect poorly on the Jewish people as a whole.
Okay, so where does it come from? And why is it, so powerful? They throw that label against anybody and any of us who even begin to talk about things like Zionism, begin to talk about the genocide that's going on in Palestine. Where does it come from? Why is it so powerful?
Well, apparently at the dawn of the creation of the Zionist movement, there were powerful financial interests that aligned with Zionism. And that provided some of the financing for people moving to Palestine. And it also provided a lot of the cover politically and media-wise for activities that were going on. That continued, particularly in Britain, where the City of London, the Rothschild Bank was there. That was a major financier of war, etc. So these are powerful interests. And if I can digress just for a minute to point this out here, it's significant to note that between 30 to 40% of all billionaires in the United States are Jewish. In fact, I saw a list of the 10 most wealthy billionaires in the United States, and 6 of them were Jewish. One of them was Mark Zuckerberg, who gave $450 million to the Democratic campaign in 2020. So there's a lot of money behind this. There's a lot of media power behind this, and there's a lot of social power behind this. And all of this has been used by the Zionist movement to protect from public knowledge the atrocities that have been committed in Palestine.
All right. Most people, I think, are aware of IPAC, the Jewish nonprofit Political Action Committee. Tell me a little bit about how they influence the United States government, political policy, and the general population.
Well, this movement was started in the 1950s. I think at that time it was recognized that if the Zionist movement was to be able to be solidified and protected, that it had to be attached in some way to the Holocaust, which I think most Jews, in fact, there was a recent op-ed by Naomi Klein in The Guardian where she said Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism and has nothing to do with the Holocaust. It's a fake connection. But back in 1950, it was decided that a political action committee needed to be organized in order to ensure that Zionist voices would be heard in the United States. That eventually developed into AIPAC, which is an incredibly powerful organization. AIPAC and all of its various other organizations that are part of it and its subsidiaries throughout the United States probably comprise at least 1,400 people and has access to billions of dollars in funding. What has happened is that this movement has used the system of campaign finance in the United States to essentially purchase the loyalty of the entire United States Congress on the issue of Israel to be carried out in the manner in which AIPAC decided. And that had various components to it. Number one was to ensure the continued support of Israel financially and militarily. Number two was to make sure that nothing was done in terms of allowing Palestinians to return to their homes, stopping the construction of illegal settlements in the West Bank, stopping the periodic bombing, etc., of Gaza, and that has been successful. They have basically been able to push around every American president on these issues by using the power of Congress to let the president know that their policy, if it involved creating a Palestinian state, stopping the building of settlements, or conditioning Israeli aid to any of those policies, that it was going to be completely unsuccessful because Congress would not go along with it, following the lead of AIPAC. It has been incredibly successful, perhaps the most successful movement, political movement in the United States in terms of impact on U.S. policy regarding a foreign government, Israel. We are basically, the Congress of the United States is basically a subsidiary of the Israeli government. I hate to say it, but it's true.
Okay, let's talk about the Congress of the United States. You mentioned how they really under the complete control of AIPAC. I have heard, and I think I've seen a list at one time or another of the number of congressmen and senators who are Jewish or have dual citizenship in the United States and Israel. Tell me a little bit more about that, because I don't know what the numbers actually are, but obviously there are enough of them that they basically are not having any problem going along with AIPAC and this Zionist agenda. And for many of these people, it's not really about money. AIPAC contributes to the campaigns of every single person in the Congress and the Senate. And if they don't swear allegiance to Israel, they're not going to make it. They'll lose really tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of campaign contributions. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I don't really see it as a Jewish issue. And yes, there are Jewish members of Congress, and yes, many of those are dual citizens. And yes, there should be a question about that. But the biggest Zionists in Congress are not necessarily Jewish. And I don't think this really has anything to do with Judaism. It does have something to do with political power. What I have heard is that in the Democratic Party, that Jewish political contributions comprise about 70% of the political contributions. We've created a system where if you can't raise an enormous amount of money, whether you're running for the Congress or the Senate or even the presidency, you are not going to be able to be elected. So what that has produced is a Congress that has been purchased by not only AIPAC and Israeli interests, but many other powerful interests, whether it's in the military, uh, in industry, in social media, in technology, etc. This is a indication of the rottenness of the political system that depends on money to be elected. And what has been the result is that the people that are elected have no interest in serving the interest of the American people. They are there to serve the interests of their political contributors who perpetuate them in office. Because remember, Regis, if you look at what has happened in the Congress of the United States, if you can get into Congress, let's say Nancy Pelosi, these people are not bound by the same rules in terms of inside information, et cetera. These people tend to become enormously wealthy over time. Nancy Pelosi has been in Congress for a long time. She's now worth, I understand, some $200 million. This is true of many, many members of Congress who enjoy returns on their investment of 100% or more. So it's more of an indication of the rottenness of the political campaign system and the manner in which we conduct our political campaigns than it is the ethnic or religious background of the representatives. I don't see this as a Jewish issue, and we need to make sure that it's not seen as a Jewish issue, because most Jews, I do not believe, are going along with what has been happening in Israel. Most of the kids, and many of the kids that are protesting now are Jewish. There are survivors of the Holocaust and their families who are joining these people and letting people know this should not be seen as being done in the name of Judaism. This is an aberration of Judaism. And I think we need to keep that in mind if we're going to make progress on this issue.
I think it's pretty safe to say that the United States Congress is corrupt. The United States is well known for accusing many other countries and states around the world of corruption. But in the United States, they don't call it corruption. They call it political contributions or lobbying. It's the way that they use language to completely confuse people and completely rotate the entire conversation. You mentioned how important media control is. Can you give me a couple of examples of how the media has presented this narrative and actually censored any alternative views?
Well, the narrative has to be of an innocent Israel under assault by terrorist Arabs. And that has been, you can see that carried out in many, many media. What has happened is, and AIPAC has been a part of this, they have conducted extensive surveys to determine what language is and is not conducive to furthering the narrative that they want to conduct. There was a memo that was recently leaked by the New York Times that found that they cannot use, their journalists cannot use the word occupation. They can't use the word genocide. They can't use words that actually describe what's going on. And part of the success, the financial, political, and economic success of the Jewish community in the United States has been the fact that they are able to purchase and control much of the written and visual media in the United States, and to determine what will and will not be covered. And you see that consistently across the board, not only in terms of the narrative involving Israel, but Regis, we've discussed this many times. A false narrative was constructed about Russia, and it was enforced to the point where they were finally able to create a set of conditions that provoked Russia into invading Ukraine in order to prevent the genocide of millions of Russian-speaking people in the Donbass. That was constructed over a period of time, and it persists to this day. So this construction, this media construction of Israel, is part of an overall system of propaganda that we've all been subjected to over time. But where Israel is concerned in particular, it is very, very, very divisive and destructive, because anyone that attempts to provide information to the American public outside the narrative is attacked, censored, and many of these people have had their careers destroyed. And this is an ongoing problem. And it's only until more and more people decide that they're not going to allow this kind of censorship and control and band together to allow the American people to get an accurate view of what is actually going on in the occupied territories and in Israel. It will only be after that before we can break through this system of control and do something about the ongoing atrocities that are occurring in Israel. Atrocities, by the way, that are inflicting grievous injury on the psyche and the future of Israel itself.
We're going to talk about that in more detail, and I don't know if we can get to it tonight, but we definitely will do that. I've asked you if you could do a follow-up show on this coming Thursday, and you've agreed. So we're not going to hurry to get through this. I really want to cover this in detail. Now, continuing on about the media and how the narrative has been constructed and perpetuated for decades, really. Most of it portraying Israel as the victim, as they were in the Holocaust. Extremely powerful myth that nearly everybody in the world has embraced. They've accepted it as gospel truth. Now, how else does the media control and protect this narrative? For example, what we're talking about tonight on the show, people will never read in the US and European mainstream media. So part of it definitely is censorship, but how else does it happen?
Well, a lot of the mythology that we in the United States believe comes from Hollywood and Hollywood movies. And we've seen this through the portrayal of the conquest of the West, etc. It's also been used to help construct this narrative of Israel. I want to tell you a personal story about my journey. As a young girl, I read Leon Uris's Exodus. I completely believe the narrative about Israel as this struggling, terrorized, weak, and put upon state. And it really, and you're a busy professional. I was, and you read the newspaper where you're going to get just one version of what is actually going on. And it really wasn't until I think around 2006 when I read Sandy Tolan's The Lemon Tree. And The Lemon Tree is a book that looks at this issue from the perspective of a Palestinian and of an Israeli, and goes back through their history, both as an Israeli and as a Palestinian. And what I learned in that book was that there was a history of the creation of Israel that I had never been told or advised of, and that was a history not of an innocent victim, but of a perpetrator of violence and terrorism in order to basically deprive the existing residents of that country of their homes and their land and their livelihood. And so that led me to begin to take a look at what was going on. And the first thing that I noticed was that Hollywood was producing year after year after year movies that put Jews in a good light, reinforce the narrative of the Holocaust. The movie of Exodus, which was released, I think, in 1962 or 63 was an incredibly popular movie, and it reinforced this victimization and the justification that Jews had about the conquest of Israel. And you see that theme reinforced throughout the media, whether it's on television, whether it's from commentators who use language that reinforces the narrative. Because remember, they've done focus groups, etc., to decide just exactly what language should be used to enforce that narrative. And you see that reflected in every news article that's written, in every TV presentation that's made, in every series that's on television, whether it's a series that portrays Arabs as being nothing but terrorists and Jews and the IDF as being nothing but heroes. And you see that theme perpetuated over and over again, where through the repetition of all of this, it's instilled in the human psyche. And remember, this is something that is inevitably true. It is much easier to fool someone than it is to convince them that they have been fooled. Once this narrative is entrenched, it is very difficult to get people to re-examine the premise behind their belief system. And because that is a known fact of human nature, this is why all this effort has been put into creating a narrative, reinforcing it with language, making sure it's repeated over and over again, that they see it in more than one venue so that it becomes common knowledge that's almost unassailable in terms of overcoming.
Yeah, and that's an incredible phenomenon. Some of the alt media have put together clips of the mainstream U.S. media, MSNBC, Fox, NBC, ABC, CBS, and you can see these teleprompter readers articulating the exact same language and points, one after another, after another, after another. It's an incredible phenomenon. Most people can't watch 4 or 5 networks at one time. They watch one. So they have no idea that the same script is being read, the same narrative is being read everywhere. And that's how it is really so incredibly powerful. That's where the American public get their information, is from their television. And when they see it reinforced like this, day in and day out, it's incredibly powerful.
There's a point that needs to be made right here, and that is that not only is the narrative reinforced through the media, but if you want to have a job in the media, you can't deviate from the narrative. If you do, you will no longer have a job. If you are an academic, ask Mr. Finkelstein. If you deviate from the narrative, they will make sure that you no longer have a job in academia. They will blackball you everywhere. What happened when the protest started at Columbia University? These Jewish billionaires came out and said, we're not going to give Columbia any more money unless you stop these protests now. Another billionaire came up and said, we want the names of every one of these students because we want to make sure that they're never hired on Wall Street, that they're never hired in any of the major law firms, that their careers are put into right now. This kind of oppression and censorship has been going on for a long time. And so it's just like Noam Chomsky said in terms of his book, Manufacturing Consent. You know, the person who was asking him the question said, well, so you're telling me that, I hold these beliefs? Chomsky said, no, I'm telling you that you would not be in this position to be able to ask me these questions if you did not hold these beliefs. So there's censorship and basically persecution all the way up the line unless everybody that has any ability to communicate with the American people is completely in line with this agenda. And there are no exceptions. And when an exception is found, they are terminated. And there is a history for this that can be easily documented. And by saying this, I'm not being anti-Semitic. I'm just recounting the facts. The facts simply and history simply cannot be anti-Semitic. We cannot live in a world where truth is prohibited, where facts are prohibited, where reality is prohibited. We have to have the ability to have this conversation openly and not be canceled.
Yeah, uh, it's amazing. That's really what's happening. Uh, one of the other things that prohibits people from speaking out when they know the truth, they know the facts, is not just the fear of never being hired or losing their job. It's social isolation from their circles of influence, their families, their neighbors, their colleagues at work. And I know I've discussed this with several people. It's so powerful. And I think we all have friends who probably we have lost because they're afraid to agree or speak out about the truth and about history. You articulated that so well. One other thing, um, Orwell in 1984, he talked about language. Can you give any examples of how language is being censored, neutered, and absolutely inverted 180 degrees? Isn't this actually also what's happening?
Oh, yes. I mean, I don't have all of, maybe at another time I can have all the words because, there was one of the Hasbara publications that was leaked that was said, say this, don't say this. In fact, for these protests, it's like this organization is a hate organization. This organization supports terrorism. This organization is anti-Semitic. These kinds of words and language is used to just terminate the discussion. But, the best example recently was the New York Times memo that was released where it said, you can't use these words. You can't talk about genocide. You can't talk about occupation. You can't talk uh, about ethnic cleansing. You can't talk about these things, even though those are actually the things that are going on. You have to talk about something else because to associate those words with Israel is counter to the narrative. Israel is not supposed to be engaged in an occupation, even though they are. Israel is not supposed to be engaged in the theft of property and land, even though they are. Israel is not supposed to be engaged in ethnic cleansing, even though they are every day. Israel is not supposed to be involved in genocide, even though that's exactly what's going on in Gaza and has been going on in Gaza really since the blockade was organized in 2007. So there's a whole variety of language that can't be used and language that is mandated to be used in order to describe the situation because it creates in the mind of the recipient the reaction that is designed to increase support for Israel and Israel's occupation.
So we're talking about a couple of things here. Zionism is not the same thing as Judaism.
Not at all.
Uh, and to clear up that myth is really important. The myth of anti-Semitism, speaking truth and using historical facts gleaned over decades and decades and decades, exposing the truth about Israel, the formation of Israel, is not anti-Semitism. And I completely agree with you that not allowing an open discussion of these facts and truths is what is keeping most of the people in the Western world blind and oblivious to what is really going on. I want to transition now a little bit.
Before we leave this subject, I want to
Yeah,
reinforce. I want to reinforce something. Naomi Klein is a Jew. I think a lot of people know Naomi Klein. She's been a pretty prolific author, uh, disaster capitalism, etc. She and a number of other Jews in New York held a street cedar, I think it's called cedar, And the point that she made in that ritual that was conducted in New York, along with many, many other Jews, was that Judaism is not Zionism, and Zionism does not represent Judaism. That Judaism is opposed to murder, theft, and coveting the property and the goods of others. There have been a couple of other, two or three other articles that have come out recently by Jews that discuss facts that have not been discussed here to date in the media. One was in the New York Review of Books, where the author was actually in the West Bank and discussed how these Jewish gangs act, and the fact that they stopped people on the road and told them if they didn't leave, they would be murdered. How they went to a school and dug 4 graves, telling people that this is where they're going to be buried if they didn't move. And how these people acted like psychopaths, and how they acted with the assistance of the Israeli Defense Forces. There was another article in the London Review of Books discussing the Holocaust after Gaza, and this is becoming clear to people that you cannot perpetuate a Holocaust of the Palestinian people while clothing yourself in the history of the Holocaust of the Jewish people. That is in fact anti-Jewish and opposed to the tenets of the Jewish religion. And these are Jews saying this, not me. So we need to make that fact very, very clear. And I urge people, go to the Guardian and read Naomi Klein's op-ed. She's very, very clear about this in no uncertain terms. And I think many, many, many Jews agree with her.
Yeah, just their voices are not getting through. Just like our voices are not getting through, having a very difficult time. It seems like we're all preaching to the choir, but the choir.
We never get outside our circle. That's a good point, Regis. How in the world can we get outside our circle? That's a good point.
Yeah. I've pondered that question a number of times with a number of people, but that's for another time. You've been talking about violence, terrorism, this genocide, and you've talked about trauma, and we're going to get more into that now. Everything that's been happening to the people of Palestine, and I would have to say even to the rest of the countries in the Middle East, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, anybody who has opposed Israel in the past, have been threatened. They've actually gone to war and been defeated. They've had terrorism happen in their countries. And these are all weapons that Israel has been using for a very long time. We'll get into that a lot, either tonight or in the future show. But I want to talk about the effects of this violence and terrorism and mass bombing, the genocide, the occupations, the forcing of millions of people into refugee status. Tell me about your experience in dealing with trauma and how the trauma that's being inflicted upon the Palestinians is far greater than anything you or I have ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, I was a trial lawyer, and throughout my entire legal career, spanning about 50 years, I represented people who had experienced trauma, either a life-threatening injury or a life-altering injury, or the death of a loved one, unexpected death of a loved one, and including institutional sexual abuse. The effects are long-lasting. The worst effects that I saw were in the sexual abuse cases that I handled, involving the sexual abuse of children by Catholic priests. what we saw there was that even many, many years after the abuse, the effects of the abuse persisted. What happens, particularly in a child, when a traumatic event occurs, whether it's sexual abuse or violence or war, is that, you know, the body produces stress hormones and other kinds of chemical reactions that has an effect on the development of the brain. And it has an effect upon how that child will react even as an adult. What I saw in my cases involving sexual abuse by the Catholic Church is that when these children became adults, well, first of all, following the abuse, they began to not do well in school and to become disciplinary problems. A lot of them developed problems with sexual abuse and personal violence. They got into fights. They were unable to engage in functional relationships. And it had an impact across the board in terms of how they managed their children and their lives. And so this is from that type of trauma. The trauma that we're talking about in terms of what has taken place in the Palestinian Mandate goes well beyond that and involves overt violence and destruction. That it goes well beyond anything that anyone in the United States has experienced outside of maybe being involved in a tornado and having your home destroyed. But that's a single event that goes away and you have help rebuilding. These people are completely powerless. And that was the other thing that was noted in terms of trauma and abuse. The position of the person abused, particularly if they felt powerless, if there was no one they could turn to for help, that had a tremendous impact upon the extent of how the trauma affected them in the future. And so here, with the Palestinian people, Regis, they've been powerless the entire time. No, very few people in countries have consistently come to their defense in a way that has been effective in changing their circumstance. And the sad thing is that if they do nothing but accept the occupation, the brutalization, the violence, the ethnic cleansing and the genocide, it persists. But if they resist and try to resist the occupation, they're labeled as terrorists. Because one of the ways that people who are powerless can resist a more powerful entity is through acts of violent destruction that's akin to terrorism. And so, particularly starting with the Second Intifada, where Palestinians turned to suicide bombing, that harmed the reputation of the Palestinians. But once again, when you're in a position of powerlessness, you have to use the tools at your disposal to try to change the situation. And no one of any power has ever come to the assistance of the Palestinians in terms of trying to create meaningful change in this unequal power arrangement.
Let's talk about the different types of tools that Israel's been using. One of them is the mass incarceration of innocent Palestinians. They just disappear without any accusation, without any trial. Would you agree with that? That also is an incredibly powerful technique that induces trauma, not only on the ones who were incarcerated and maybe tortured, but on the rest of the population, the families. It's got to be utterly terrifying.
Well, what Israel wants to do is it wants to have a number of people within the West Bank and the occupied territories and Gaza that are basically informants for Israel. So it holds over everyone's head the threat of incarceration and having violence inflicted on you. the need of someone may have a relative that needs medical care. They can use that as a tool to get cooperation. And yes, in 1977, for the first time, really, I think in a British publication, an article was written that described the torture that Palestinians were being subjected to in the occupied territories, and that included, you know, hanging, hooding, uh, beatings, burnings, electrocution, uh, a sexual trauma, and if you notice in the Iraq War, when Abu Ghraib was exposed, those were the precise techniques that the American military was using against the Iraqis. So these were techniques that were developed in Israel and then transported outside of Israel, including to the United States. So it is well entrenched. In fact, you know, the thing that started this conversation was I sent an email to you and to a couple of other people pointing out that a very well known uh, educator at the Hebrew University had spoken out against genocide and against the occupation, and that she had been arrested and thrown in to prison and is subjected to the same kinds of torture that Israel subjected Palestinians to. And so that threat hangs over the head of any Israeli that wants to speak out against the existing ongoing policies. Another thing that has been noted that has been taking place during this last episode of genocide is that these people who are arrested are bound by their arms and their legs in a very uncomfortable position, and they are left in that position for months, and that has resulted in amputations. The other thing that has come out recently is the fact that it's been discovered once Palestinians are able to return to areas like some of the hospitals that were destroyed, they have discovered mass graves where bodies within those graves were also bound. Some of them were were bound. Some of them were nude. Some of them still had medical apparatus like IVs and all of that attached. And some of them were missing their skin. So the claim was made to Israel, we need to investigate this. And Israel just simply denied. They said, we don't do anything like that. We didn't do anything like that. We're not going to allow outsiders in to investigate this. And here's the bottom line about what's going on in Gaza so that everybody understands it. Israel has complete control over who can come and who cannot come, and they do not allow outside reporters to go in there. The people that do go in there that do not follow the rules are murdered. Almost 100 reporters have already been killed. We know from the recent murder of the people that were working in that kitchen that no one is safe if the Israeli Defense Forces decide that you need to die. They control the skies, they control everything. And so whatever information we get is limited by the fact that there is this system of control that has been put into place to censor and create the impression that perhaps the information coming out of Gaza is not correct.
Yeah. One of the other tools you mentioned is denial and outright lying. This is one of the most powerful tools going. They play the victim and then they deny everything that that they're accused of doing, and they lie about everything constantly.
After I know we probably want to cover this at another time, but let's just talk for a minute about October the 7th, because after that, there were a number of lies that were put out by a particular group in Israel. Those lies included the fact that there were massive rapes that were perpetuated by Hamas, that children were beheaded, that they were placed in ovens, that they were strung along on clotheslines, and that they were intentionally murdered. All of those allegations have been looked into, and no support for any of them has been found. The New York Times did an extensive report about the mass rapes, and people looked into that. And there were articles that were written about what kind of evidence was available to substantiate what the New York Times was reporting. And what they found out was that there was none. There were no reports from women of being raped. There were no reports to the various rape crisis centers in Israel about people being raped. There was no evidence from anyone coming forward that they had been raped. Now, I'm not saying that no atrocities occurred on October the 7th. You know, after the fence came down, it wasn't just Hamas that went into Israel. It was a lot of other organizations that may not have had the same level of military discipline and control that came in, and who knows what they did. But here are some things that we do know, because this has been substantiated. Number one, we know that Hamas did not have heavy weapons. Okay, so those pictures that you see of all of those destroyed automobiles at that music festival, those automobiles, which contained Israelis trying to escape, were not destroyed by Hamas. There was an Apache helicopter that went up and rearmed at least twice, that had Hellfire missiles that were fired at those cars and at people on the ground, because there was mass confusion. They didn't know who was Hamas and who wasn't Hamas. And Israel has this doctrine called the Hannibal doctrine, where it's better to kill an Israeli than to allow them to be taken captive. And we know from facts that have now emerged that in order to expel Hamas from Israel, that the IDF used tanks to fire into these kibbutzes, and that they are the ones that destroyed these buildings and killed the Israelis that were inside of them, along with Hamas. So a lot of the destruction that we see that occurred on October the 7th was not perpetrated by Hamas, but was perpetrated by Israel. And the other fact that makes people wonder is why it took Israel so long to respond. They had been warned that Hamas might conduct some type of operation, and yet most of the people that were supposed to be protecting the kibbutzes around the periphery were gone. They weren't there, and it took hours for a military response from Israel to take place. So there hasn't really been a full investigation of what went on here, but there are serious questions as to what actually happened and what could be blamed on Hamas as opposed to what could be blamed on the IDF.
Yeah, good points. And it's also been reported somewhat widely that Israel has never, or the IDF has never, restrained from killing their own for their own agenda, the advancement of their own agendas. Probably a lot of that had to do with what you described about Apache helicopters, which Israel has. They don't.
Yeah,
Killing their own people.
Heavy weapons, none.
Yeah.
They had RPGs and some firearms. That's all that they had. Now, I think this change, this Hannibal directive, has been a relatively recent event, because if you'll remember, back in the day, and I can, the next time we talk, if you're interested, I can have the exact date. In return for one Israeli soldier that was taken, there was an exchange of a large number of Palestinian prisoners. I think that's one reason why Hamas conducted this operation, because they wanted to get hostages that could be exchanged for all the hostages, basically, that Israel had arrested and was maintaining without charge, including children, in Israeli prisons. But the Israeli program had changed, and the policy had changed. And now we learn of this Hannibal doctrine, where the IDF can kill an Israeli rather than allowing them to be taken hostage. And I think that's a relatively new development, which just goes to show the deterioration of ethics within Israeli society itself. To go from a society that treasured one life so much to where you would exchange hundreds of hostages in return for that life, to a policy that allowed you to kill your own citizens rather than allow them to be taken hostage, that's to me is a reflection of the decline of the ethics of Israeli society as a result of what has happened over the last 80 to 90 years.
We're going to dig deeper into that probably in the next show. The impact and effect it has had on Israel and the population of Israel. But I want to continue with a little bit of the time that we have left discussing trauma and the effects of trauma. But before I ask you about some of those effects and their long term, as you pointed out, I want to talk about some of the tools. We've talked about outright murder. Israel has, some of their snipers have been shooting little children in the head for sport. Now, that has got to traumatize not just children, but anybody, adults, men, women living in that society. You see the pictures of them holding these children, and there's blood all over the place. Just those images are traumatizing. They can even traumatize people like you and I, just ordinary people seeing that stuff. It's so anti-human. It's so incredibly horrific that it causes kind of a mental state of PTSD. Let me talk a little bit about just the bombing, the destruction of their homes, their hospitals, their schools. War is probably the most traumatizing tool event in history. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And, the Palestinian population has been subjected to constant war, really, since even before 1948 and the UN mandate that created Israel and the supposed Palestinian state. But in Gaza, here's the dynamic. There is no place to hide. If you go to one part of Gaza, if Israel decides that might be where Hamas is hiding, they'll bomb you there. If you go to another part, they'll bomb you there. If you're outside, they'll shoot you. I understand that they were using drones that had recordings of babies crying and women crying for help. And when people went out to see if they could help, the drones were kill them. And so not only is there this sense of helplessness and this sense of absolute, abject, constant terror that you might die, that everyone you love might die in an instant, but there is no relief, there's no place to hide, and there's no way to make it stop. No one is asking Israel to stop. No one is forcing Israel to stop. No one is saying, we're not going to give you any weapons if this is how you use them. Israel has complete control over the United States Congress, over the current president that we have, and we just appropriated another $26 billion to replenish their armory of weapons and to assist their state in not collapsing as a result of what has been going on in the occupied territories and Gaza as a result of this operation. So I can't find the words to describe what it must feel to be a human being and to watch everyone you love get killed, to believe that you are going to be murdered at any minute, to believe that you could have your ability to move, to walk, to think, to care for yourself eliminated any minute, that everyone that you love could be eliminated at any minute, and that there is no place to hide, and there's nowhere and no one to help you in terms of making sure that you can be safe. There is no safety, and human safety is the very epitome of what it requires to develop a normal human being in a normal fashion, to be able to relate to other people and to be able to function in our world. You have to feel safe. There is no way for Palestinians to feel safe, no matter where they are in Gaza or in the occupied territories.
There's been so many instances of the use of, they're not even terrorist techniques, the use of violence and brutality on people. I've been thinking while we've been talking of Rachel Corrie, the American young woman activist that went to try to stop the bulldozing of Palestinian villages so that Israel could build their own communities. And she was run over by a bulldozer. I'm thinking this had a very profound effect on many Americans who saw that. It certainly did on me. But it's another example of, to the Palestinian people, you stand in front of a bulldozer, you oppose the occupation of your territory and your villages, this is what's going to happen to you. You'll even get run over by a bulldozer.
Well, the point about that is that the bulldozer operator did that. How is it that you can create a society where a bulldozer operator will run over a young American woman who is not doing anything other than trying to prevent some atrocity from occurring? One thing that the listeners need to understand is everyone over the age 18 in Israel has to join the Israeli Defense Forces, with the exception of the ultra-religious who've been given an exemption. This means that every woman serves 2 years in the IDF, every man serves 32 months. They all participate in all of these activities. They are forced to man these checkpoints. They're forced to shoot at Palestinians that throw rocks. They're forced to shoot Palestinians in the leg. They're forced to accompany these settlers when they steal someone's home, when they bulldoze someone's home. They're forced to arrest these Palestinians. They're forced to use terrorism and to use torture when the Palestinians are incarcerated. Every Israeli participates in these activities, and that has been going on ever since the Stern Gang was incorporated into the IDF at the very inception of Israel. So these kinds of techniques have been part of the Israeli Defense Forces from the very beginning, and every Israeli has participated in that. That means every Israeli has been subjected to the same kind of violence and brutality and terrorism, and has participated in those same brutal tactics, and have witnessed those tactics being perpetrated on even children and women. And so what effect does that have on the psyche of the people that participate in that? In order to develop a defense mechanism, you either need to accept that that is normal behavior and acceptable behavior, or you need to turn this kind of behavior onto yourself and develop moral issues about it that have an impact on your life. And this has been going on, Regis, for generations now. Every young Israeli has gone through this. And so we're faced with a situation where it is entrenched and ingrained in Israeli society that these people are less than human, and that anything that needs to be perpetrated on the Palestinians to advance Israeli interest is justifiable, and that no one is ever going to pay a price for anything that they do to these people. In fact, I understand that the IDF told their soldiers before the beginning of the Gaza war, you will not be prosecuted for any of your actions during this war. And that has led to these soldiers acting with complete lack of discipline and doing things that soldiers who are under a unified command, operating under the moral wars of law of wars, would not perpetuate. So we have a situation where all of this violence has now rebounded onto the Israeli population, and we are seeing the effects of that in how Israel is conducting itself in Gaza today.
Yeah, I want to dig much deeper into that on the show on Thursday. But to conclude tonight, what are some of the effects that all of these actions of Israel against the Palestinians, from torture, from imprisonment, from bombing, from assassinations, what are some of the effects that these tools, these actions of the Israelis are having on the Palestinian people, the survivors, their children, and for future generations? Sum that up for me, please.
Well, it's instilling hate. It's instilling hate in the Israelis that are capable of perpetrating these acts, and it is instilling hate and anger into the surviving Palestinians. They may be damaged emotionally and physically, and they may be wounded psychologically, but they understand how that happened and who perpetrated that. And so I think what they're creating is a generation of people who are determined to avenge what they have seen happen to them and to their families and to their community. It's unspeakable, really, when you think about it. That I mean, there are millions of Palestinians and millions of Arabs, billions of Arabs around the world, and everyone's watching this, and the effect is the building of hate, division, and the desire for revenge.
Yeah, it reminds me from the Jewish Old Testament, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And it seems to be what violence perpetrates. Violence promotes violence, and it's a never-ending cycle. Sylvia,
Hurt people, hurt people.
Yeah,
that's the truth. Hurt people, and we have a lot of hurt people on both sides. We have Israelis who have been damaged by their actions, and we have the people that they have damaged, the Palestinians. And so they're hurt people on both sides, and hurt people want revenge. And we are perpetuating a cycle of hate and war in the Middle East.
Sylvia, I want to thank you for this very important discussion, busting the myth of anti-Semitism, the tools that Israelis have used to traumatize the Palestinian people, in addition to trying to commit genocide, wipe them off the face of the earth, the hypocrisy to hide behind anti-Semitism when they are perpetrating the same thing that they had inflicted upon them in the Second World War. Thank you so much, Sylvia. We'll look forward to continuing the discussion on Thursday.
Thank you, Regis.